Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for this very important and timely lecture hosted by the Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights at Rutgers University Law School in Newark. We are extremely privileged to have with us today Dr. Amy Austin Holmes as part of our Transitional Rights and Security Lecture Series that we're hosting for the year. And this is our second lecture, and one that is on a topic that's very dear to my heart as an Egyptian American and someone who has studied the Middle East and Egypt in particular, particularly through the lens of authoritarianism, rule of law, democracy, and human rights. So I'm delighted and honored to have Dr. Holmes with us today. And before I formally introduce her, I want to just quickly tell those in the audience more about our center in case this is your first time engaging in our events. The Center for Security, Race and Rights is the first civil rights center at a U.S. law school that focuses primarily on the civil and human rights of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians. We do it through a cross-racial, interdisciplinary, interfaith approach, and we also look at the connections between transnational geopolitics and events and domestic civil rights and human rights. So we are, I think, very well positioned to address issues that are frequently in the news, particularly as it applies to Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities and diasporas in the United States and in the West in general. And my name is Sahar Aziz, and I'm the founding director of the center, and I'm also a professor of law at Rutgers Law School in Newark. So I would, before again the formal introduction, I just want to say how delighted I am to have Dr. Holmes, who I consider a friend and a brilliant scholar, taking time out of her busy schedule. As you'll hear from her today, she has gone to many places, some of which are quite dangerous, in order to engage in fact-finding and seeking the truth on issues that are often subject to misinformation campaigns and propaganda campaigns, both by authoritarian regimes in the Middle East and also by the United States government, depending on what the political interests are of the speaker. So Amy Austin Holmes is currently a fellow at the Wilson Center while on leave from her tenured position at the American University in Cairo. She has a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. She's a former Fulbright scholar in Germany and is the author of the new book, which she will be presenting today, entitled Coups and Revolutions, Mass Mobilization, the Egyptian Military, and the United States from Mubarak to Sisi, published by Oxford University Press. She's also the author of the book Social Unrest and American Military Bases in Turkey and Germany since 1945. Having spent a decade living in the Middle East through the period known as the Arab Spring, Dr. Holmes has published numerous articles on Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Tunisia, and Bahrain. Professor Holmes is the first person to have conducted a field survey of the Syrian Democratic Forces based on numerous trips to all 6 provinces of northeast Syria between 2015 and 2019. Her current research is about governance challenges of the semi-autonomous Kurdish-led region of northern Syria. This includes a focus on the protection of minority groups, as well as the dilemma of ISIS detainees who are currently held at Al-Hol camp. So what we'll do is we will have her present her book for approximately 30 minutes, and then that will be followed by a Q&A in which I hope many in the audience will fully engage, and you can always ask your questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. So with that, I will pass on the virtual stage to Dr. Amy Austin Holmes.
Thank you so much, Sahar, for that kind introduction. I hope everyone can hear me now.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So yes, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak today and to present my book, Coups and Revolutions, Mass Mobilization, the Egyptian Military in the United States from Mubarak to Sisi. So I began teaching at the American University in Cairo in 2008, and I lived there throughout the period of upheaval that led to the overthrow of Mubarak, and then the overthrow of Mohamed Morsi, as well as the rise to power of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and the subsequent counter-revolution. And so my book is divided into two parts. Part one covers what I argue is a revolutionary period of upheaval that took part in three waves of mass uprisings. The first against the Mubarak regime and, the police state that protected Mubarak. The second against the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, and the third against Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood that he represented. And I dedicated each chapter in the book to one wave of the protest movement, so one wave of the revolutionary uprisings, and then also one chapter to each of the two different phases of counter-revolution. And the title actually of the chapters is taken from what was, I believe, to have been one of the most popular protest slogans at the time. So the first chapter, the upheaval against Mubarak, was "Ashab yurid isqat al-nizam," and then the second chapter against the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, "Yaskut hukm al-askar," down with military rule, etc. So, and even during the wave of the subsequent two waves of counter-revolution, I also chose protest slogans because protests did even continue after the coup in 2013, although there was a fierce wave of repression, especially after the Rabaa massacre in August 2013. But so that's just to sort of orient. I don't know how many of you have actually had a chance to read the book, but that's to give sort of a brief orientation to how the book is organized in terms of, it's organized chronologically, and the chapters, the titles of each chapter are taken from protest slogans. But during each of these waves of protests, I analyzed the role of four actors: the Egyptian military, the United States, the Egyptian business elite, and the multi-headed opposition. And I argue that the revolutionary nature of each of these three uprisings between 2011 and 2013 is that each of them actually wanted more than just the removal of the ruler at the top. So, for example, the protests against Mubarak were also very much a protest against the police state and police brutality. And in many ways, we can even see some parallels to some of the protest movements that are happening now in the United States, the Black Lives Matter movement, and also protests that revolve around the issue of police brutality. Because the revolution on January 25, 2011, I mean, when it began on that day, that was actually a day to commemorate the role of the Egyptian police in the 1952 revolution. And so what started out as a movement against police brutality turned into a massive uprising that overthrew Mubarak within just 18 days. So, so this was, the first wave of this revolution against Mubarak and his police state. The second then against the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, which was essentially an unelected military junta, between 20 to 25 people that were part of the SCAF that ruled the country for about a year and a half. And during this period, really for the first time in modern Egyptian history, I argue that there was a new type of activism that emerged, which I consider to be a kind of anti-militarist activism, meaning that they were actually opposed to the role of the Egyptian military in society and in politics, and that this was something unprecedented previously. And I think that this, in my personal opinion, this wave of the revolution was actually the most radical, attempted to fundamentally change the nature of power in terms of the relationship between the Egyptian military and the state apparatus. And yet this wave of the revolution, I argue, is the least understood. And it tended to, it's been kind of overlooked, I think, so far by a lot of scholars and journalists and in the media. Whereas there's been much more attention to the first and the third wave, meaning, of course, the uprising against Mubarak and then the protests that brought down Mohammed Morsi. But what actually happened in between those two uprisings, I think was very important. And it's important that we understand, I think, where those, where those activists were sort of coming from, but also what they aimed to achieve. And although, some of the groups that emerged that I discuss in my book, Mossarin, Kazabun, no military trials. There was a campaign against virginity tests that were conducted on some of the women that were detained in protests, so-called virginity tests, which is of course actually a form of state-sanctioned rape. These kinds of protests, these groups, some people have argued, well, those were relatively small groups, or they didn't have like a mass following, but the impact that they had was went actually far beyond the actual size of people that were actively involved in those groups, I argue. And I think that if Egypt ever does transition to civilian rule, it will be because activists during that wave actually laid the groundwork for that to happen. And so this second wave of anti-militarist opposition to the SCAF, I think, is very important. And that's covered in one chapter of my book. And then the wave against Mohamed Morsi, I argue that what happened beginning really that 1 year that Mohamed Morsi was in power from 2012 to 2013, I look at how opposition to him emerged over time. And I argue that what took place was what I call a coup from below. So this is one of the new concepts that I've introduced in the book, where I contrast this period in Egyptian history with what happened in the 1950s, between especially 1952 and 1956, which has sometimes been referred to as a revolution from above, where you had, at the time of Gamal Abdel Nasser, you had a group of junior ranking officers that overthrew the monarchy, evicted the British, redistributed land, and changed Egypt from a monarchy into a republic, and thereby truly carried out a revolutionary, change of the Egyptian regime, characterized by relatively limited mobilization of civilians. There were, of course, civilian mobilization and civilian protests, also relatively limited repression compared to now. And that, so you had really, it was these junior officers that were the protagonists, whereas civilians were kind of reacting to the actions of the military at the time. Again, relatively limited repression, followed by a change of the regime and a revolutionary outcome. Whereas this period, which I argue can be understood as a coup from below, is characterized by mass mobilization of civilians. It was the civilians that were actually the protagonists, that were driving the nature of what has been called I think erroneously, the Arab Spring, but it was the civilians that were driving this. And then it was the senior officers in the SCAF, not junior ranking officers, but senior ranking officers who had a different class position than in the 1950s, the senior ranking officers who acted to ensure their own interests, who used mass repression to essentially resurrect the old Mubarak regime through overthrowing Mubarak and reinstating military ruler Abdel Fattah al-Sisi through sham elections, which led to, I see, as a counter-revolutionary outcome. So this is how I contrast revolution from above in the 1950s with a coup from below, which took place beginning in 2011 until now. I see this counter-revolution continuing until the present. And so part 2 of my book then looks at the counter-revolution, which I also divide into 2 waves. The first under Adli Mansour after the coup, who was technically the head of state at the time, and then after the first elections for Sisi in 2014. So during the first wave of the counter-revolution, the regime's priority, I argue, was to eliminate the Muslim Brotherhood and end all protests by targeting both Islamist and secular activists and regain control of the streets and university campuses. And during this time, they really targeted any activists who had the ability to mobilize nationwide. So that included the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, but it also included secular activists, as well as, for example, some of the football fans. It included April 6th. It included student unions at the public universities all throughout Egypt, because they also had networks spanning the entire country. And I think what the regime was doing at the time was to sort of stop any group that had the ability to organize nationwide, that had networks that spanned all of Egypt. And so I think this is what they were doing during the first wave of the counter-revolution. And again, that included brutal repression, not just the Rabaa massacre, but other massacres that took place before that. I happened to be at Rabaa the night before the massacre and at Nata the morning of the massacre. And this is really, it's been described as the Tiananmen Square of Egypt, where, in broad daylight, in downtown Cairo, in a city of 20 million people, security forces opened fire and killed approximately 1,000 people in a single day. And this is a real turning point in Egyptian history. I will personally never forget this. And the fact that this happened, and essentially with impunity, I think is the reason why we still have this ongoing repression until today, until now, because there was really never any accountability for the Rabaa massacre in 2013. The second wave of the counter-revolution began after Sisi was then elected in the so-called, elections in 2014. And then I think that the nature of the state repression changed. Then the target was not these activists that had the ability to control the streets, to call for protests. Those had already been essentially silenced or put in prison or driven into exile through the protest law that was issued also in the fall of 2013. But then the target was really any civil society organization that had the ability to do kind of anything independent of the regime. So independent NGOs, independent women's organizations, independent charities, scholars, intellectuals. The regime also, as soon as Sisi was elected president, one of the things he did was to change or to give himself the power as president to instate not just the president of public universities in Egypt, but also the deans of every faculty at every public university in Egypt. So he has the ability as president to determine who is the dean of the faculties at public universities in Egypt. So the regime also really clamped down on universities during the second wave of the counter-revolution. So I argue that the nature of the coup, which I call a coup from below, determined the nature of the crackdown. So precisely because it was a coup from below, characterized by mass protests, there were mass protests against Morsi that reached deep and wide into Egyptian society. The crackdown also reached deep and wide into Egyptian society. So I believe that this concept of coup from below is more useful than competing concepts. Some people have said, well, it was a popularly supported coup. Well, it was popular for some, but unpopular for others. Other coups have been called revolutionary coups, for example, that brought about revolutionary outcomes, but this was clearly a counter-revolutionary outcome. So this concept is just meant to point to this contradiction between the confluence of top-down military intervention and bottom-up mobilization. And so I maintain this was a coup, but not the kind where you had a small cabal of officers that conspire in secret to remove the chief executive unbeknownst to the public, but that this was a very, very much a response to this popular mobilization. And that's one reason why the United States and the European Union failed to designate it as a coup. Some of you may remember, officially the US officials under the Obama administration at the time came out with a statement saying, because officially, according to US law, we should cut off aid to a country that, where there's a military coup, and Egypt gets the second highest amount of military aid in the world. So we should have cut off aid, but the Obama administration determined we did not have to determine if it was a coup. And so I think one of the reasons this happened is because the coup didn't seem to fit the understanding or definition that we'd been working with until then, for both scholars and policymakers. And so, even Secretary of State John Kerry, he at one point said the Egyptian military was restoring democracy. I think Catherine Ashton from the European Union also made some similar statements. But I think if we expand our vocabulary and the way we can talk about different kinds of coups should allow us in the future, should a similar confluence occur of top-down military intervention and bottom-up protest, should allow us to not just as scholars or academics talk about this, but also for policymakers to allow them to take the necessary consequences, which should have been to immediately suspend all US military aid to Egypt, which did not happen. It was only later that then there was a partial suspension of some, weaponry, some equipment that was sent to Egypt. And then that was restored after the elections in 2014. So and I guess I would just maybe make a few other remarks. I mean, in terms of comparing this current wave of unrest that we're seeing across the region, if you compare it to, again, the 1950s, what happened if we think about the wave in the 1950s, it really began in 1952 with Egypt. It continued until 1969 in Libya, when you had these sort of Arab nationalist revolutions at the time in the 1950s that led to the eviction of the British or the French colonial powers, and instated for the most part Republican forms of government in various countries, and the ideology, of course, that was driving this was Arab nationalism, and so they've been referred to as Arab nationalist revolutions. And so I just want to make 2 points about this. First is that the timeline, if you think beginning in 1952, scholars and historians argue that this sort of wave of Arab nationalist protests lasted until 1969. So that's like 17 years, 18 years. So it's a long wave, it's a long protest wave. So of course, there's no reason to think that this current wave of protests that we've been experiencing since 2010 in Tunisia will also last for 17 or 18 years. I mean, history does not repeat itself, obviously, but it's just to, remind ourselves that this could continue for some time. I mean, these kinds of protests could continue, for another 10 years, for example. I mean, if we look historically at how long these kinds of protest waves have lasted in the region. And so it's not over yet, I guess is my point. And secondly, many, scholars began to refer to the protests when they started in Tunisia in 2010 and then spread to Egypt, then Bahrain, and then Libya and Syria, etc., Yemen, as an Arab Spring. And I've argued that really, I think that's incorrect, because it was not just Arabs who took part in those protests. There are important non-Arab minorities in the Middle East, in Egypt, the Nubian minority, for example. And if we call this an Arab Spring, we really kind of erase them from that. And I think that's not doing justice to the diversity of the region. And so this is why I've tried to avoid using the term Arab Spring and to, use other terms, and that, it's also part of our, I think, responsibility to reflect on the words that we use, because I think words matter. And I guess maybe I'll just say, sorry, one last comment is that in the book, I also then look at other cases of what I see as coups from below in Turkey, or I compare Turkey, Burkina Faso, and Thailand, where I think there were similar confluences of military intervention and bottom-up protests that actually happened very soon after the 2013 episode in Egypt. So if people are interested, I could mention that. Or, I'm happy to take questions on anything people would like to ask me about. but I guess I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Holmes. That was very informative. I recommend everyone read this book. It's an excellent book, and these are really complicated issues. So I'll start the Q&A, and I'll encourage those who are in the audience to use the Q&A feature, but I'm going to start the conversation with a few questions that are somewhat interrelated. So the first one is, I thought it was interesting how somewhat optimistic, I should say, that you argue what happened, particularly under SCAF, under the military, the Supreme Council on Armed Forces, from February 11, 2001 until around June 30th, 2012, when Morsi was elected. And that laid the groundwork. That was a time when you had that anti-militaristic activism that laid the groundwork for possibly a more robust civil society and a civilian governance. So I think that's very optimistic. I can't help but be somewhat pessimistic or because of what's happening now. In other words, I think it's no secret for those of us who know Egypt pretty well is that the Sisi regime is very methodically doing everything it can so that there can not be any more mass movements, from the obvious imprisoning the Muslim Brotherhood to imprisoning the youth activists, but it's even getting to the point where social media is under surveillance, Facebook's under surveillance. As you said, he's going after anything and everything, and even more importantly, his regime's making sure there is no way that anyone can even have a large following, including this young woman who had a huge following on Instagram.
TikTok. Yeah.
Right. Or TikTok TikTok. And suddenly she finds herself 3 years in jail under some pretextual trumped up charges of indecency when I think it's because she just has so many followers and that regime doesn't want anyone to have any followers. So ultimately with those facts, I just worry that maybe there was groundwork laid, but has it all been negated? And so in light of that, how can whatever was established at that period, how can that continue to support it? So maybe if you could give us a little bit more information about what happened during that 12 months period or 16-month period that you think laid that groundwork.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that during that time, it was very common for people to say that the fear barrier had fallen. And so people were no longer afraid. And there were also many taboos were being broken at the time. So, I think this is obviously something that is being rolled back, that there is clearly an attempt to silence people, to make people afraid again, and to, essentially, I mean, so I agree with you. The thing is that during this time of, the year and a half or so that the SCAF was in power, there were, I think it was, there weren't just the street protests that we would see in the streets. I mean, I actually begin the book with this vignette where I was out one evening with a group of friends to celebrate someone's birthday at a restaurant, and they started, standing up and chanting against the SCAF in the restaurant, like while they were having dinner. I mean, so it's sort of, this remarkable cultural, change that was suddenly happening, that it wasn't just, okay, we go to work or we go to school, and then when we're done, if we have time, we go to a protest. But like, protest was everything. It's like your whole life was like a big protest, essentially. I mean, whether you were, at work, at school, at dinner, at a restaurant, in a cafe, I mean, everyone was like always protesting. I mean, at least this group of people, and not everyone all over the country, obviously, but for those who consider themselves revolutionaries, and that's how people identified. I mean, everybody was, was calling themselves, I'm a revolutionary. I mean, I support the revolution. So they also embraced this term. So it's also quite remarkable if we think now about some of the 2017, for example, when Nubian activists were demanding that an article that is already in the Constitution be implemented. So that's not really revolutionary. It's actually just asking that something that's already in the Constitution be implemented. So it's maybe a reformist demand. It's not a revolutionary demand, because what they were asking for was already in the constitution, right? That guaranteed that Nubians have the right to return to some of the land from which they were displaced in the 1950s. So that's, you know, that's what they were asking for, but there was a massive crackdown against them. They were all thrown in jail. One of them died in prison of intentional medical neglect. Gamal Surur, who was the former head of the General Nubian Union in France. And so my point is that now even anyone, any kind of demand is met with massive repression. But, you know, back in 2011, 2012, 2013, there were incredibly, you know, revolutionary demands, and that was just something normal, you know, to go to a restaurant and suddenly start demanding the fall of the military regime. I mean, it's, you know, if you have to sometimes like remind yourself that that was normal back then. And so I think, I just think that the people who have lived through that, they won't forget it. No matter how much repression there is, no matter how many people are in jail, the people who live through it, they won't forget that. And it's also similar in a way to, I think, what's happened in, you know, in China after the Tiananmen Square massacre. The Chinese government has done everything they can to suppress the memory of the Tiananmen massacre. So you can't even Google like Tank Man, for example. Like if you want to find that iconic image of the person standing in front of the tank at the Tiananmen massacre. So the Chinese government is trying very hard to erase that memory. But that proves that they themselves have not forgotten it, right? And I think the same is true in Egypt. I mean, they're trying very, very hard to make people forget, but people won't forget. And clearly the government hasn't forgotten, you know, the government officials, because they are, all of their, you know, everything they're doing now, I think, is informed by what they saw as a threat to their rule. And so this memory, I think, will not be erased.
We shall see. There's another question related to the role of minorities in the mass mobilizations, uprisings, failed revolutions, many different terms to try to describe this phenomena. The role of Christians in the origins of Arab nationalism, you noted. Other than the Nubians, what other certain ethnic groups or minority communities would you say played an important role in these protests across the Arab world?
Sure. So, you know, in Egypt, the Nubian minority played an important role. Also the Coptic Christian minority played a very important role. And some of the groups that I mentioned, Sally Toma, for example, a Coptic Christian woman, she was one of the leaders in the Asker Kazabun movement, which means military are liars. Wael Iskandar, a Coptic Christian activist. So there were actually Coptic Christian activists that were very active in these movements, in addition to the Nubian minority in Egypt. If you're asking, I think the question though is more broad, even about the larger region. Clearly, I just came back from Syria, from the northern part of Syria, where you have a large Kurdish minority. You can't understand what's happening in Syria if you ignore the Kurds. You cannot. Like, you have to sort of understand what are the Kurds doing in Syria and how are they cooperating with the other both religious and ethnic groups in Syria. So that includes the Christian minority in Syria is quite diverse. You have Assyrians, Syriacs, Chaldeans, there are Yazidis, in addition to Kurds, Circassians, Arabs. So, you know, Syria is in many ways even more diverse than many of the other countries in the region. And so this is why it's not really accurate, and it's unfair even, I think, to call it an Arab Spring when there are all of these other non-Arabs that were part of these protest movements until today. And so I would just, yeah, that's my my advice, or my my suggestion for the terminology that should be used. You know, and in Syria, I mean, you know, back in after 2012, 2013, it became very common to call the north of Syria Rojava, which means Western Kurdistan. as one of the 4 countries that has Kurdish minorities, in addition to Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. But as actually the area that they control expanded into Arab majority regions like Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor and Tabqa, they actually officially stopped using the term Rojava in order to be sensitive to the Arab concerns, because they're all now living together in this kind of semi-autonomous region that's not under the control of Damascus. And so they stopped using the term Rojava because they want to be sensitive to the fact that there's not just Kurds that live there. So, so anyway, that would be, I think, a whole separate discussion, but yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Another question that is a common narrative, right, in the West, which is there's a certain psyche within Western media, even among Western elites, and certainly I think among Western public, that's taken root and reinforced that most countries in the Middle East are not suited for liberal democracy, but fare better under the strongman leadership. And I mean, we all know there's a lot of Orientalist undertone to that. But in your experience, do you believe this is a myth? How can we, the bigger question is why, right? Why didn't democracy come to the Middle East? And after all the revolutions that happened, or mass uprisings, we'll say, in Eastern Europe, and I think you and I remember the days when there was all this punditry about, oh, finally it's the Middle East turn, and that's what this whole Arab Spring was about. But as we've seen it, I don't think other than Tunisia, it turned out to, I mean, I would argue it turned out worse for a lot of the people. So could you discuss a little bit more about this, the elusiveness of democracy for this part of the world?
Sure. So, I do actually put part of the blame on the United States and the European Union, and also on some of the other Middle Eastern countries that were all very interested, or how should I say, we're not doing enough to, I think, respond to the wave of repression. So as I mentioned earlier, the United States did not follow our own laws. Like, we didn't obey our own laws that should have triggered an immediate suspension of military aid after the coup in July 2013. That did not happen. It wasn't until after the Rabaa massacre in August, and then later in the fall, that this partial suspension of aid happened. So we are partly to blame because we didn't actually take the necessary response to this wave of brutal repression that happened in broad daylight. Again, the Rabaa massacre happened in broad daylight. There are thousands, possibly tens of thousands of images, video, photos, tweets, all about this massacre. If you compare to the Tiananmen Square massacre, you have really that one iconic image of the man in front of the tank, right? But it's like, I remember learning about the Tiananmen massacre growing up, and yet I have no connection to China. I have no Chinese ancestry, never been to China. But the Tiananmen massacre became, it went viral, and it was something that was discussed in mainstream media in the United States. Whereas in Egypt, although the Rabaa massacre happened in broad daylight, and we have thousands, tens of thousands of images, it didn't become, I think, a topic in the mainstream media, or it did for a short amount of time, and then it dropped out. And so, I partially blame the response of the United States, the European Union, the lack of media attention, and also, frankly, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who began immediately pouring billions of dollars into the central bank in Cairo, and essentially to prop up the post-coup government. Because whereas the United States and the European Union were kind of divided in terms of what to do, some wanted to cut off aid, others didn't, and so it led to this sort of wishy-washy, we decided or we're not going to decide, essentially, response. Whereas in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, they were resolutely united in doing everything they can to prevent the Muslim Brotherhood from succeeding, ensuring that he would fall, and then trying to prop up and support Sisi. So you have to look at the role of these international actors really to understand. And so I think, and finally, I would just say the African Union suspended Egypt, because according to their bylaws, if you have a coup, you get kicked out of the African Union. And so they did. I mean, they took the necessary consequences of their own laws. And so if the African Union could do that, why couldn't we, the United States? I mean, you know, so you have to look at these international actors, I think, and their you know, culpability or responsibility. But of course, in Egypt, there is a segment of the population that wanted the military to return to rule, to return to power. But it is not the case that everyone who went out and protested on June 30, on 2013, that they wanted the military to come back to power. They wanted maybe Morsi to step down. They wanted early elections, but all of those protests were not a demand for the military to come back to power. They were a demand for Morsi to be accountable to the revolution, essentially. Yeah, if people want to know more about that, I can talk more, but I want to make sure there's time for more questions.
So we'll conclude our meeting today. Before I turn it over for some finishing remarks by Professor Holmes, I just want to thank everyone for attending, encourage you to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Twitter is RUCSRR, facebook.com/RUCSRR, and we also have an Instagram account. We use our accounts intentionally to be a source of information and a source of education, so trying to counter some of this information we talked about today and other lectures that we have. Our next lecture is going to be on October 5th by Azadeh Shahshahani, who is an Iranian-American, a lawyer, the director of legal services for Project South, and she's going to talk about the relationship between the Muslim ban and Iran sanctions and how these international developments in US-Iran relations are affecting Iranian-American diasporas. And I think that is a topic that's not only extremely timely, but one that's rarely discussed, especially from the perspective she's going to bring. So I hope that many of you all can join us. And I will then cede the virtual floor to Dr. Holmes with any closing remarks that you'd like to give.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for hosting this discussion. I guess in conclusion, I would just say, especially because of the coronavirus and the COVID situation, we should be particularly cognizant of the fact that anyone who is in prison is particularly at risk of the COVID and coronavirus. And because the prisons in Egypt are very overcrowded, it's impossible to have any kind of social distancing, and the fact that the coronavirus can actually spread easily in situations like that, I think really should, you know, there's an urgency to this, and I hope that policymakers in the United States, students, anyone will, you know, remember this, and also, you know, use the time in maybe that we're in this situation now with COVID to remember not just how it affects us in our everyday lives, but those, you know, estimated 60,000 political prisoners in Egypt, and the fact that, for example, in Algeria, it was possible to improve the conditions in the prisons even under Bouteflika. So even under the dictator Bouteflika, the conditions in the prisons eventually were able to be improved through work that was done, for example, by the ICRC. Whereas Egypt does not allow access to prisons until now. And so it is possible to make improvements in people's everyday lives and to improve the conditions in the prisons, even under a dictatorship, which is what Egypt is now, sadly, but that we shouldn't, you know, we shouldn't give up hope, and we shouldn't forget those who are imprisoned and potentially at risk of getting the coronavirus.
Well, thank you very much. All right, we will see everyone on October 5th. Thank you very much, Dr. Holmes. And if we were in person, we'd all be clapping, but that was very informative. Thank you, everyone.